As Bitcoiners, one of the most common questions we get from pre-coiners is, what about regulations? Can't the government just ban Bitcoin?
And if you're the type of person who only consumes legacy media sources, you probably think so. So our next panel is going to discuss just that, the impact of regulation on open source software. This panel is moderated by Stephan Livera, Bitcoin podcaster. I'm sure you've all listened to him. Let's give Stephan a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you to the crypto couple. I think they're doing a great job. So we've got a panel today with some great guests on the impact of regulation on open source software. So just give me a moment to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have the Cryptochronomancer, Peter Todd. Welcome, Peter.
We were going to argue in Amsterdam, but then...
Yeah, not yet.
And next up, we have Bitcoin consultant and educator, Giacomo Zucco. Welcome, Giacomo. VP of Research at The Block, Larry Cermak. Welcome, Larry.
Thanks.
And lastly, we have crypto blogger Eric Wall.
Stephan, I told the organizer not to put me next to
Yeah, got to coordinate the heights and everything, you know. So today we're here to talk about not just height of photography, but also impact of regulation on open source software. So let's start out. What is open source software? What are we talking about here? Peter, do you want to start us off?
Well, I mean, do you want the sort of free software, and free isn't speech, and
it's, you know, when someone says open source software, what does that mean? What comes to your mind? What's the first thing?
I think the simplest way to go put it is it's the way software is built these days. And you know what it comes from is we've realized we can just go share source code, and people can go implement things and run things, and you know do what they want with the code, and it's kind of taken over the entire world. I mean, open source software is the mainstream way you build software. You go share source code with other people, and they go and run the stuff and compile it, and you know, it's sort of a collaborative enterprise. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean open source software the way Bitcoin does it matches the way Google does it, but the basics of you make the code available is basically there.
Okay, so how would you contrast then, or if anyone else wants to jump in, how would you contrast that then with open source software and closed source software? Or the licensing.
The funny thing is that open source software is a little bit like unhosted wallet. So at the beginning, all software was open source. Like when computer science started, the idea of patenting some speech, which is a way to organize ones and zeros, was not present. Then there was a commercialization of intellectual property that was an attempt to create a solid business model and destroy this kind of sharing of knowledge. Then there was the free software movement and the open source movement, which is like a little bit like Bitcoin and crypto. You know, the free software is like a very opinionated movement with some strong ideas about intellectual property, and open source is the palatable version for normies. And in Bitcoin, the nice thing is that it's not an ideological battle anymore. It's not that you go open source because you read Richard Stallman. You go open source because users have to verify your code, otherwise you will just steal their coins. So they need to verify your code, at least on the front end. And because if they censor you, you want somebody else to take up your job, so you make code harder to censor if it's spread out and everywhere. So there is a practical need in Bitcoin, which is above the ideology.
I see, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the interaction then. So software and speech. Right now people talk about this idea, particularly in America, but is there a connection here? Is there a relation between software and speech?
I mean, in the US, it's very clear that software is covered under freedom of speech. You know, writing software is an act of expression under US law, and acts of expression, they're subject to the First Amendment. And, you know, this is something which has been well established even going all the way back to the 90s with, of course, PGP, where there are, of course, crazy like legal hacks around there. I mean, PGP at one point, you could go buy it in book form. You know, there were RSA implementation go fit on a T-shirt. But, you know, after the lawsuits kind of settled down, it was very clear, obviously, software speech.
Okay. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that argument will hold, and potentially what about other jurisdictions? Let's hear from you guys.
So, when you were a child and you wish that you could transfer a thought to another person, open source software code is the closest approximation of that thing, that you can transfer something that you have conceptualized to another person, to other people. It's one of the most beautiful things that exists in human society, the idea that we can open source code. And I think if there's one thing that's worth fighting for, worth dying for, it's probably like freedom of speech. And if there's anything that's even close to that, I would say open source software comes pretty close. It's one of the most beautiful things that we have in society, and it's really worth fighting for.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is that's totally right. It's one thing we're fighting for. What's really important is to keep protecting that, because the alternative of that not being the case, even though it's established in law, basically all lawyers agree that it is speech, but the alternative is really scary, and that's that if it's not protected, how far can it actually go? It can go back to the internet. What happens on the internet? Are you going to go after the developers that developed some of these protocols? Same with torrents, Bitcoin, CoinJoin, Tornado Cash. All of these, I think, are comparable. And I think the alternative of that not being free speech is really scary. And I totally agree with Eric. It's one of the things that should really unite all of us is to fight for that to continue being the case. And I think it is possible it's going to be challenged in the future at some point. I don't think it's as established as all of us think, unfortunately.
I think one thing is that Peter is right that it's established, at least in the US, that code is speech. But the problem is that it's not established anymore that speech is protected. Yep. Because, before we just mentioned Julian Assange. If that's not infringement, criminal infringement of freedom of speech, I don't know what it is. So code is speech, okay. Is speech still protected in the US as well? That's a harder question.
Well, of course, today we have Elon Musk going and buying Twitter, and one of the remarkable things, of course, in US law, the First Amendment is supposed to apply to the government. But one of the really remarkable things that's come out lately is the US government has been pressuring and working with institutions like Twitter to go restrict speech. And bizarrely, it actually is one of these very rare cases in the US where you really do get First Amendment violations. Normally it's a corporation, they can do what they want. But, we are having this discussion around very different topics than, say, Bitcoin core source code and things like that. But, if you didn't bring that up, I would have brought that up too. And I think it's very relevant. And we don't know where this is going to go.
So here's another question I want to pose to you as the panel. Does that mean if the US has a stronger protection on this idea of code as speech or First Amendment rights, what's the implication for developers? Should developers be in the US? Or what's the situation for non-American developers?
At least if you look at it from a crypto perspective, maybe not just looking at Bitcoin, you can already see developers moving outside of the US for some of these concerns that they have regarding regulations and regarding potentially, having to go to jail if there's some issue with how their code is being used. So I think absolutely, I think people are moving outside of the US, and I think it will continue happening more and more. And I think we are also seeing more and more developers in crypto. Obviously in Bitcoin it's quite normal, but in crypto just becoming more anonymous, not doxing as much as they used to. It's very common, and it's not just for securities violations. It's also for just complying with sanctions. You really don't want to be responsible for your protocol having to comply with sanctions, because if it can't, what's the alternative? Is that you're responsible, you go to prison. And I think that's why a lot of these people go outside of the US. And I think we're going to get to it with the Tornado case, but it's not just one person, right? There are two other founders, and I think the reason why they have not been really arrested or are in prison right now is because they were not in Netherlands, they were not in the US. It's because they were in a jurisdiction that maybe could not extradite them. And these issues are becoming more and more common, and I think more and more developers in crypto as a whole will be anonymous and will try to kind of preserve their real identity.
Keep in mind the Tornado Cash case, they would have been currently much better off had they been in the US. Because at least at this stage, being in the Netherlands, you can, in the Netherlands, the police can go hold you for, I think it's like 6 months without even charges.
Yeah.
And while they're doing this, they go auction off your stuff. The U.S., there's a lot of bad things you say about the U.S., but it's not that bad. And at least at this point of the trial, they would have been better off elsewhere. I'd also go say in general, the answer here isn't to say everyone should move out of the U.S. or everyone should move out of the Netherlands. It's that we're much better off if we have diversity of developers. Some threats work, you're more vulnerable in the U.S. Other threats, you're more vulnerable in other places. You want developer teams that, well, collectively, you want them collectively to not be vulnerable to any one threat.
Yeah, sure.
It's interesting because, you asked, should developer move to the US? And Larry was answering that developers are moving out. It's paradoxical because the US is a place where probably there are like 2 tiers. When you're doing something that is not critical, geopolitically critical, which is something like, copyright infringement, probably you have better protection, considering cases like the Pirate Bay in Europe. While when you're doing something that touches some critical parts, like Julian Assange, Tornado Cash was not the only case in the Ethereum camp either, because there was the guy doing conferences in North Korea, and it was a violation of a request of the American government, but it was speech. He went there to speak with people, literally.
Yeah.
So it's a second case. So probably the difference, if you are low key, probably you are better off in the US than elsewhere. If you reach some threshold of geopolitical relevance, there's probably more effort going to be put from the US government than other governments. But as Peter said, it's better to just edge and spread.
So I think also a nuance there is it also depends on what kind of thing you're doing. If you're doing something that under US law is clearly established as legal, you're probably in a much better place because the US just has less ability to arbitrarily go and, go put people in jail. I mean, it's notable how Julian Assange, all of his troubles happened outside of the US.
Yeah.
And had he actually been in the US, potentially he might have actually had better protections in some circumstances. It really depends on what you're doing. Again, like with, I forget what the Ethereum dev's name, but anyway, the guy who went to North Korea. Yeah, Virgil Griffin.
From the Ethereum Foundation.
Yeah.
So as I understand, so for anyone who's not familiar, as I understand, he went to North Korea and gave a briefing to people on how to bypass sanctions.
Yep.
And obviously he got in trouble when he went back to the US, and I believe,
He's
don't
still in
correct me if
prison.
I'm wrong, he's in
still,
jail for 5 years?
He's still in prison, yeah, I think for another 3 years at minimum.
That's a good example. Had he listened to his lawyers, who, actually, my understanding is he actually did go talk to lawyers about this, and they basically said, don't do it that way. And had he done it in a different way by, say, publishing articles, he'd probably be a free man right now.
Yeah.
But he made mistakes that crossed over the legal threshold in the U.S. Whereas in other countries, it'd be much more about, does the country like you? I mean, Russia goes and poisons people with polonium.
Yeah. Larry, you had something to
Yeah,
add?
one thing I would add to that is that also intent is quite important in the U.S. law, and it's difficult to kind of say that it was not your intent to, not do that when you actually go there in person and do that, versus, for example, Tornado Cash dev, which it's more difficult to prove that he was actually trying to launder the money because he wrote the code. So I think it's slightly different, where one of them is more simple to actually prove the intent of him doing something that was not allowed, versus here just kind of allowing other people to act that way.
Yeah.
Also, I think Tornado Cash case may sign an escalation, because if you think about it, I don't know if anybody is familiar with Butter Project and Popcorn Time. So Popcorn Time was a great software to watch stuff on BitTorrent, just like you do on Netflix. Super great UX, very easy to use, and it was pretty famous. So the founders, Argentinian developers, they had some legal problems, so they shut down Popcorn Time. They created Butter Project, which is a software that only allows for legal content, and then you just change a configuration line, and then you are still on Popcorn Time again. And they had no problem with that. So back then, this kind of legal arbitrage with code was working.
Right.
In a way, Tornado Cash, you can just claim that it was just coding stuff.
Yep.
Of course, it was profiting from the token, but then again, a core developer, which was also Bitcoin rich, isn't profiting from the token. So the threshold is moving in a way. Before, the developer was safe because it was not like Ross Ulbricht was running actively the website. So it was in a dangerous position, while a developer was just developing. Brian Cohen with BitTorrent ended up winning most cases, right? It was basically untouched. Now, things are changing because law is not static. Laws evolves. When you take money out of the state will change regulation to take money back.
So there's a culture. Go on.
One really interesting thing that I think you touched on, and I don't have an answer to it, but I wonder what other people think at this panel, is just like the ability to profit from something. You brought it up as someone for Tornado. Do you guys think that that's an important aspect of like actually going after someone if, for example, they made some money off of it? Or should that person be protected the same as a person that maybe was just an open source dev and actually made no money?
It certainly makes the politics of it more complex.
Right.
You know, if all you've done is gone and earned a bit of money by donations, it's a very different story politically than if you've made $10 million on like coin join fees or something.
Well, ethically, it's clear that if an action is ethical or unethical, the fact that somebody else gives you something in exchange cannot change it. Like if killing somebody is ethical, it's not that if you get paid, it's not. So it doesn't make any sense from an ethical point of view.
Yeah.
But politically, if you get money, you are also from the public opinion, you are seen with less kind of clemence because you are a rich guy getting rich out of that. So you deserve it in a way. So it's politically problematic to make money. The problem is that with Bitcoin and shitcoins, the kind of scheme that you can use to profit is changing, and it's more complex now to define.
So in the Tornado Cash case, let's talk a little bit about what happened there and any lessons for, let's say, Bitcoin developers coming out of this. So does anyone want to just give just a high level background for people who aren't sort of familiar, with, at least with the facts of the case as they are right now? Does anyone want to just?
Well, Eric, you're the Ethereum guy, so.
Right, so in the beginning of August, for the first time in history, they put a contract address on the OFAC sanctions list. Never before have they ever put a contract address on the OFAC list. It's always been people. It's been people
or entities.
I mean, to be exact, it's being addresses controlled by keys, not scripts.
Right.
Right. But to the previous point, I think there has to be a reaction. So there's two ways that we can react to this. One is on the judicial level. So we can fight this. Coinbase is already suing the Treasury Department. David Hoffman and Coin Center is suing the Treasury Department. But there also needs to be an attrition of talent. Like the US government needs to understand that when they intrude upon the freedoms that we all are supposed to have, they're not supposed to be able to get away with that. So the first thing that happens is that, they get sued when they do this. The other thing that happens is that talent moves overseas. So we need to show them that there is a reaction to the actions that they're doing. We're not going to stand for this. And they're going to learn that this is not something that is going to be beneficial for the US. It's going to lead to talent going overseas. It's going to lead to extremely difficult court cases for them. So I don't think that we should just lay down and be defeated. I think we need to fight this in every way that we can. So what happened in this case was that so an address, a contract address was put on the OFAC list, and Alexei Pertsev has been in jail for, I think it's 78 days now.
Yep.
And I think he can be in maximum they have to build a court case. So they haven't actually charged him for anything. Like there hasn't been a formal case yet. Because what they can do, they can just put a person in jail, and then they get 90 days to formulate what exactly are the charges they're going to pin on him. So right now, as of yet, we don't actually know what they're going to charge him with as of now. All we know is that he was one of the developers that contributed code to the Tornado Cash GitHub repository, which is unprecedented in history. That a person, and if they're going to go at us at that level, that they're actually going to put us in jail if we're contributing to code bases, then this whole fucking thing is off limits. Like, what are we going to do? Like, if you build tools that are just there to give privacy to people, if they put those kind of people in jail, that's unprecedented.
Well,
and
It's not unprecedented. I mean, this is what the crypto wars were about over PGP. You know, like, there were efforts to try to get people in jail over that for.
Yeah, but they never put us on the sanctions list before. They never put it on an OFAC
I mean, I'm not even sure that the sanctions list existed in the 90s.
The OFAC was not existing, but it's not unprecedented, but it was a fight that people thought we had won already in the 90s. Yeah. So in the 90s, there was a fight about cryptography being speech, you know, the illegal number on the T-shirts, and that fight was legally won. And the cypherpunk won, basically. And now that is being put into debate again. So it was not a stable.
It's important to recognize that this case is different than the PGP case because, you know, to give a good example, one of, I forget which university it is, but, you know, a well-known cryptography professor, Matthew Green, he pushed for it to be made clear that the code itself in the Tornado Cash case is not sanctioned. You are free to go republish the code. Now, of course, a lot of places like GitHub and stuff, they've taken down repositories of it, but they were going above and beyond what the sanctions actually requested. And, you know, Matthew Green has since gone and made a repository available on GitHub with all of this code base for people to go study and learn from. And what's, I think, different here is that, you know, as an example with PGP, the issue of whether or not you were allowed to run PGP, as far as I know, wasn't really legally discussed in the crypto wars. I think it was kind of as a given as, well, you know, the fight's about whether or not you can publish the code. Even if republishing the code was legal or illegal, whatever, we're not really going to talk about whether or not you're allowed to use it. And that's kind of, I think, you know, that legally was kind of a separate thing that didn't really get.
So you're saying it was unresolved?
Yeah,
that particular
part
point was unresolved.
And, you know, it's notable how in other contexts there's also been discussions around whether or not you're allowed to go encrypt. I mean, there are countries around the world trying to go ban encryption. And when I say ban encryption, like, you know, HTTPS, they want to go ban that. They want, you know, your website to be on a new, you know, like going to your online banking to be on a new protocol where the government has a backdoor. You know, India is trying to go push legislation along these lines. So, you know, that side of it, I don't think is that resolved. And hopefully in the U.S., we'll see it resolved in the same way. But, you know, we'll have to see what happens. But
I think it would be fair to assume that legal battles are important as well, and they have to be pursued. But probably it's possible that we live in a different world than the 90s. Yeah. So the 90s we believe that, you know, the end of the history with the government trying to leave internet
what
free.
Tornado Cash does is a different thing than PGP. You know, particularly because Tornado Cash needs to run on the Ethereum network, which is highly centralized. So it's not hard for, you know, to attack that by attacking the Ethereum network. Whereas like PGP, I mean, we all have computers in our pockets that can go run PGP. And it's a much harder thing to go and restrict that. Not as hard as it should be, because getting software onto, say, iPhones as an example is
I mean, who cares if Ethereum is centralized or not? What if someone made a code upgrade to the Lightning network that's just supposed to make it more private to transact on Lightning, and that person goes to jail? Like, this is just showing what the U.S. government, the lengths that they're willing to go to. And yeah, now it's a shitcoiner. Like, who cares? Like, he goes to jail. But what happens when it happens to
Can someone get a copy of the code and run it legally? And also, to what extent can they go and do this even though it's illegal? And, you know, the war on drugs is a perfect example. I mean, I'm sure half the audience here has violated laws on drugs, because preventing you from smoking pot is actually pretty hard. So, you know, even though it's, you know, maybe hard to go buy pots in a lot of countries still, you can still go around and smoking it. And, you know, PGP is an example like that. I think Lightning is an example like that. But the question is, you know, how far does this control go? And like I say, Ethereum is very vulnerable to this because it's very easy to go stop the relatively few people running Ethereum infrastructure that can then run things on Tornado Cash. But it hasn't stopped entirely. I mean, Tornado Cash transactions still go through right now, just rare.
It's roughly like 90% drop in demand after these things happen. So yeah, I mean, it dropped massively, but it still works. So I would say, like, the argument that it's not it's centralized. I think it's difficult to make if it
was
still works.
if it was centralized, then these transactions wouldn't happen anymore.
Well,
but they are happening.
it's very
We
notable.
don't know, because like,
Yeah.
e-gold went on.
What do you
for-
mean we don't know?
We don't-
You can
we
just
do
look at the
know.
blockchain. You can see that these transactions
No, we
still
don't know in
occur.
the sense that it's not that if something is centralized, then it will be censored right now. So e-gold was absolutely centralized. And looking at e-gold until 2006, you would have said, oh, e-gold is not censorable legally or technically because it's going for 10 years. But then after 11 years, it's all gone. So it's not something that you can have a hint about looking at current transaction. You have to actually think about the model of attack. And I think it's clear that Ethereum could be shut down on the central level. It could be, well, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, so,
Also,
we won't get
this-
into the maximalism debate. I mean, we're going to keep it about the regulation and the impact on open
I
source.
also want to say, like, this 90% threshold, which I believe is accurate, it's but you know, as far as we know, like 90% of Ethereum miners are not mining these transactions. It's very notable that the threshold to go censor it entirely is, you know, just over 50%.
It's roughly 65, I think. Right?
Well, it's like on Ethereum, you know, if just over 50%
Right.
of miners, validators, whatever they want to call them now, chose to not build on top of blocks that contain Tornado Cash, that could be the threshold. But
It's
they're
actually
playing
less.
nice
It's
because
less. You can perform a censoring software with like 40%.
it's complex, but 50% is a very respectful number to go say. That's certainly a threshold that could happen, and
I mean, we are
What-
today at a point where 65% of blocks.
Now we are at zero reorgs. So no blocks, including Tornado Cash transaction, has been reorged away.
Yes.
Because
Right.
so
Yes.
we are at
Right.
zero chain censorship.
Right.
We are
That's
at very high block censorship.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not because they're complying with OFAC, it's because they're picking the most profitable blocks that they can mine, which come from flash bots, which is just
yeah. Well, I think the key thing to understand there is, though, the interpretation of OFAC currently as being that you personally will not go and process the transaction. You know, you won't contribute to it, but you are willing to go build on top of blocks that did. And that's a very different kind of interpretation than the worst case. The worst case could have been, oh, well, any block, you are not allowed to build on top of it if it contains an OFAC targeted transaction. And that's, you know, that could have been a much worse position to be in.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's also an argument around exploiting a gray area in a sense. Like, so sometimes governments are not a monolith, right? There are entities, so OFAC is one area. There's, you know, SEC and all these other areas. And to some extent, if they can put out a rule and there's enough uncertainty, that can cause what's known as a chilling effect or chilling factor on the businesses and the individuals who are operating in the space. So even, as you're saying, even if it's kind of unclear exactly the right way to apply the OFAC sanctions rules, individuals, because they're scared about going to jail.
Same reason GitHub took the repositories down initially.
And that is also an interesting point as well, because we're talking about open source. Of course, GitHub is not the same thing as open source. GitHub is a way for developers and contributors to actually comment, contribute, put their pull requests, and have it in a nice interface.
Clear, a centralized way.
Yes, in a centralized way. And of course, there are other ideas, people using things like GitLab to self-host their own version.
Or just Git. Yeah.
Or Git itself, which is actually more decentralized, but it's not as convenient. So what's the implication then if, let's say, GitHub is, let's say, yeeting certain people's accounts and certain people's comments are gone, so the historical record is not as clear because, let's say, XYZ developer, Tornado Cash or otherwise, their comments are no longer there on the website.
Matt Crowlow recently complained to GitHub about this, actually, where I don't know if it was anything related to Tornado Cash, but it caused some issues because one of the, someone who contributed to various Bitcoin-related repositories just had their account nuked. And suddenly all the pull requests they opened also got nuked, and a whole bunch of other history relevant to Bitcoin projects that's got nothing to do with whatever they were guilty of just disappeared.
It's a matter also of anti-fragility. So if open source and speech and Bitcoin are not attacked, people will go complacent. So Bitcoin started with, Larry was talking about anonymous developers. This is very important. Bitcoin started with a guy that was assuming that the potential risk for himself or themselves were so high that he had a perfect OPSEC, anonymous presence, pseudonymous presence. So Satoshi Nakamoto had the perfect legal protection, complete pseudonymity. So after that, we had this honeymoon phase with Bitcoin where it seemed that like there was no struggle there, privacy was just a given, and so people started out of convenience. I mean, why you are not anonymous? Because it's inconvenient. Or maybe you are somewhere else, but it's not convenient.
I did make the decision early on, would I contribute anonymously or not? And I decided not to, precisely so I could do things like go speak on panels. You know, like literally, this is why I decided not to.
Social bandwidth that you have in presence is unprecedented. If you are Satoshi, you cannot run video calls. You cannot write a podcast. You cannot do anything. Basically, you have a lot of limitation. But if the enemy doesn't attack, then you expand out of convenience. When the enemy goes back attacking, maybe I hope we will see a lot of coders getting back to one-off names that you use for one project, like Shaolin Fry did for WASP or the Mimblewimble. You create a name, you do something meaningful, then you delete it. And of course, it's not easy, especially now that people are looking into that. The time of Satoshi was easy because nobody knew about what Satoshi was going to do. So he had no pressure on his OPSEC.
And it's very hard to maintain good OPSEC for long periods of time.
It's really hard.
Like I expect a big part of why Satoshi left was because he feared, well, you know, if you keep doing this, you're going to get caught.
But very hard if you keep it, if you want to use the long-term
that same
authority.
NIM for a long time.
Yeah.
But you're saying this idea of having almost a throwaway NIM for 6 months that you use and then now you throw it away. But here's the other point that's potentially a bit difficult is it takes time to build up credibility.
Yep.
And people won't just trust a random person who sent some code through because, hey, there could be some bugs in there and it could be in a very subtle, hidden way.
I do not think the answer is for everyone to use pseudonyms precisely because of that. You know, it's very useful, especially in security critical software like Bitcoin where there's money on the line. It's very useful to have developers who have real world reputations and
multi-year, right? They've been
well, I mean, not just like years. It's like just the fact that, you know, if they went and lied sufficiently blatantly and defrauded people, they could probably get sued and put in jail. Like that's actually really valuable for
there is a
projects
reputational
around
cost
money.
and legal cost in messing up. That said,
you probably want both though. You want people with reputations at stake reviewing and people without reputations at stake actually writing code.
It's worth saying that reputation can also be a problem for Bitcoin. Like there was a famous developer introducing an inflation bug and nobody reviewed it because he was a great developer. So reputation can also be a double-edged sword. Of course.
Yeah. So the feasibility then is, and the other aspect is, let's say you are a new developer today, you're not independently wealthy, you may be looking for sponsorship or you may be looking for funding from a company. It's obviously a lot easier to do that under real face, real name, as opposed to just, you know.
Though to be clear, there are examples.
Yes,
I believe more than one example.
ZMN, SCP, XJ.
Who are receiving money under pseudonym. As far as I know, the people giving that money out do not know who they are.
Yeah.
Now, you can't do that in some tax regimes, you can in others. You know, I actually asked my accountant this once in Canada, you know, can I go pay someone anonymously? Unfortunately, the answer was yes, you can. Just make sure they declare that not in Canada or you'd have to pay GST on it.
Right, because some companies have a legal issue with that, because they're sort of like, can I pay someone without knowing?
When we tried to do the now defunct B Foundation with a lot of backlash from the community, one of the points was being able to pay from fiat money coming from known people to anonymous developers. And at the beginning, the lawyers told us that it was trivial. But then it's okay only if you can prove that the developer is not an employee of the people donating. And that's, I mean, that's the point, is anonymous.
Sounds a little bit like BitMEX founders getting in trouble for not ensuring that the users of the platform were not Americans.
Not American, yes.
So,
I mean, the nice thing is, since speed of light's limited, it's pretty easy to go and verify, like in a speed of light sphere, where someone is, even anonymously.
So I guess those are a few elements to that. So would you, I guess, going into it today, if you were, let's say somebody is thinking about becoming a developer or doing some kind of project, should they be anonymous or pseudonymous? Or do you think it's more like case by case?
Case by case.
And you can do both in the same person. Like you can create a name and work on something, and then with your persona, study that something. You can become the most known researcher about some code, and also be the person who published it. Of course, again, Z-Man that takes money, he did manage to establish a reputation with long-term contribution. So the trade-off is always there. The longer you stay, the harder it is to not mess it up.
Yeah, and especially if you're going to the conferences. Sorry, go on, Larry.
I was just going to say, I think it's difficult to make the argument that if a US government really wants to find someone's identity, even if they're anonymous, that they won't be able to. Because like we talked about before, people always fuck up. It's just a matter of time. Just like Satoshi stopped really, being in public, it's because he was, like you guys said, afraid of actually fucking up at some point. Almost everyone has fucked up. And we don't even know, like someone could still know Satoshi's identity.
With better tooling, we can certainly reduce the risk.
You
I mean,
can
it's not
reduce
gonna
the
be
risk,
zero,
but it's never zero. And I think like the US government is one of the few, entities in the world that can actually probably get the identity if they try hard enough, if they throw enough money at it.
Granted, I mean, people go sign up to go and fight in Ukraine against Russians with like a 10% chance getting killed.
Right.
Like, it's
You reduce the risk.
People are willing to take risks.
And also, that's the case for more anonymous developers, because when you just have one target, you can just invest enough resources into that. If you have thousands of targets, your resources are spread out. It's easy to track one, it's not easy, but it's possible to track one Ross Ulbricht. But if you have now thousands of Silk Roads, it's way harder to do the same level of incredible manhunt that was done for Ross.
Yeah.
I mean, pragmatically, something that kind of probably would help this is if things like GitHub had better ways to just do a one-off contribution without having to go sign up for an account. Like, it's as simple as that. Like, if I was going to go and contribute something to GitHub right now, it's a real pain to try to do this anonymously because getting an anonymous GitHub account is annoying. And of course, you can go fix this pretty easily by things like pay like $10 with Lightning to go and anti-spam your account creation. GitHub isn't going to do this, mind you, but we'll have to build our own tools.
Yeah. And what about, is there a distinction then for, now if we're talking about open source projects, is there an aspect there where a company needs to think about being anonymous or using, let's say, not having a legal structure intentionally if they're working on something that's particularly subversive?
That's the same. The problem is that for a company, reputation is even more needed. A developer can just come, throw it out, and disappear after 1 year, like Satoshi. A brand needs trust, so your operational risk go way higher. You go to Silk Road level. Of course, maybe if what you do is less or more illegal, it changes. But you need reputation. The good thing is that now you also have revenue that can be used to justify the risk. So now there is now you're making money.
That's a really key thing. Are we talking about a company or a nonprofit? Like, if it's just an organization where it's just a group of people trying to plan out something, it's a very different story than a company that's expecting to have a profit every year.
Yeah, but I mean, as an example, privacy software in Bitcoin, this kind of thing.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention and ask you guys as well on the panel, we're running out of time a bit, but for example, Tornado Cash, it was targeted because it had product market fit. Like, right, undeniably, you could see that there was a lot of money being laundered and eventually probably made its way to Korea. North Korea probably laundered it in some way, got money out of it. If you guys are right, if Ethereum dies and Bitcoin becomes, the go-to for this sort of thing, and eventually, let's say, CoinJoin or any of these protocols are used for these sort of purposes for some relatively large laundering transactions that are provable, will those developers be targeted as well? Or is that just a kind of a byproduct of, in this case, just saying it's Ethereum, developers were doxxed. Should those developers at some point be scared as well if ever CoinJoin is used for, laundering billions of dollars?
Yeah, so one uncomfortable thing is that the Lightning Network, if you think about it, is a big mixer.
Yeah, it's private.
So they get away with Lightning because
it's tiny.
The label is that this is made to make fast transactions. But if you actually think about what it is, it's a mixer.
The important thing with Lightning is technologically, if your goal is to do what Lightning does, you will have to go have if you want to be decentralized and do fast payments, your only option under computer science is Lightning, or something very similar to it. And they all have this property where they have actually pretty good privacy, and it's ultimately unavoidable in a system that's decentralized and does payments.
CoinJoin can be in the same level after cross-input signature aggregation. So there are like two major ways to have privacy in a system with global consensus like Bitcoin. One is omission. So you don't put your information in global consensus, like Lightning.
Right.
The other is obfuscation. You put it there, but you put it more to confuse.
Yep.
The second one is just like Zk-Snarks, Zcash, Monero. The second system is incentive incompatible because you can be shown to have paid more for privacy. So you have no plausible deniability. You're doing that for privacy alone. The first kind of system, you get privacy as a byproduct of staying away from global consensus. So you always have more plausible deniability. You have high fees. Why are you coin-joining with Chisa, or why are you using Lightning? Because I want to pay less fees. That doesn't save you if the government really wants you, but it can be used as one of the plausible deniability arguments.
One other, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, but if let's say CoinJoin was the protocol that was used, provably to launder billions of dollars, would those developers have a problem right now?
I think
Probably.
market developers right now are tense.
Yeah.
I mean, Wasabi is fascinating because, of course, Wasabi, they do go and have, they do go take the OFAC blacklists and go apply them. You can't, through the default Wasabi servers, go and launder coins that are directly connected there. Now, can you get around that? Well, yeah, there's probably ways, but, they're complying with OFAC in this kind of cowardly, yet I think also kind of clever way. So, who would they go after first? It's really hard to go say.
Well, we have the same thing in the crypto world where a bunch of front ends are complying with OFAC. They're doing wallet screening now, and I actually think that the way that we should interpret this is that yes, there are some companies and some people that are situated in the U.S. that have relationships with the U.S., but we shouldn't. I don't think that we should be pressuring these people to go and violate OFAC sanctions. Yep. We should invite, because as long as it's on the front end level, then you can always go and someone can fork the open source software that they have built and just remove the OFAC censoring and build another front end. That's the beauty of open source software, that anyone else in the world, wherever they are, can produce a front end. The pernicious thing becomes when they start to censor at the validator level. That's the thing that everyone has to watch out for. Right now, currently, it has to be, I think one thing that hasn't been pointed out yet is that, so Coinbase, for example, their chief legal officer has reviewed the OFAC law, so to say, and made the assessment that there is nothing in the OFAC law that compels Coinbase. Now, Coinbase is a validator in Ethereum, so they're actually processing base layer transactions. And they have stated there's nothing in the OFAC law that compels them to conduct any level of monitoring or censoring at the base layer of the Ethereum network to comply with OFAC. Now, that's great. That's a good thing that they don't consider it their role to conduct that type of censorship. But it's also a bullshit thing. We shouldn't be up to Coinbase's interpretation of the OFAC law, whether or not we have censorship or not.
But also, you cannot even trust this interpretation, even if they're true. Again, the eGold case.
Yeah, they can pussy out any second.
eGold creator asked the government, "Can I do this?" And the answer, yes.
We'll have to call it time. But great discussion. Can everyone put their hands together for our panelists? Peter, Giacomo, Larry, and Eric. Thank you, everybody.